Robert Klitzman, MD, is Professor of Psychiatry in the College of Physicians and Surgeons and Director of the Masters of Bioethics Program at Columbia University. And when I announced this on Facebook, someone said, he's very smart and he's very good looking. So I felt like, oh boy, I have to do
So that's you got the book, isn't it? But
no. Okay. So, the book starts off with someone asking you to be a sperm donor, and this kind of prompted you to write the book.
yeah, so someone I know said to me a few years ago, they're looking for a sperm donor. Would I be their sperm donor? And this is someone who I was friends with a while back, but saw maybe twice a year, sort of here in New York. But they say, you'd be perfect. Probably they were thinking the same thing that whoever wrote that on Facebook. And I thought, gee, that's interesting. No one's asked that of me before. And what would that mean? She said, well, you would just donate the sperm. You don't have to do anything with raising the kid. I would do everything. It would be my responsibility, and you don't even have to see the kid if you don't want. And I thought, well, what does that mean, right? And what would it mean to create a child who I would be biologically related to me, but I'd have no other connection with? If I wanted, I could, but she would make all the decisions. And I thought, this is an interesting world in which
It would be like being a married man.
well, that may be, but my husband and I don't have kids, so. That got me to thinking, and of course, when you start, you then start hearing stories of other people, and as I mentioned this to people, people would tell me, well, we used IVF and we bought donor sperm, we haven't told anyone, we haven't told our kid. Or people would say, well, we've bought someone else's eggs, but again, we haven't told anyone, we haven't told our kid. And so I became interested in this whole world of how we've basically, what was once sex and having children naturally was now divided up into its component parts. So you can buy and sell sperm. There's only 3 countries in the world where you can buy and sell human eggs. Only 3 countries in the world. Russia, India, and the United States. In all of Western Europe, it's illegal to buy and sell human eggs. Here, it's a big market. You go online, and there are hundreds of websites, eggdonor.com, egg-donor.com, and you scroll down, and there are drop-down menus where you pick hair color, eye color, SAT scores, college, do you want them to be a graduate degree, and the prices go up with SAT scores. You pick the religion of the egg. You can pick a Jewish egg, a Catholic egg, a Lutheran egg, and I started to think,
How much is an egg? Just a minute.
Well, it's an interesting question. So there was a limit. So obviously this gets into murky ethical territory. So for years, what the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, which is the IVF doctor organization, so it's run by IVF doctors, so they said, okay, well, we'll allow this, but you can pay only up to $5,000 for an egg. 5 to 10,000, there's a reason, but not more than 10,000. So I did work with a student. We found that they're all paying 10,000, or they're all, any reason is whatever reason wants it for 10,000. And then 2-3 years ago, there was a Japanese couple who wanted only a Japanese egg, and they found a Japanese egg donor who wanted 50,000. And this was against the rules, even though people were paying that much. So it went to court, and the ASRM was accused of price fixing. The ASRM settled, and now the prices are as much as you want to pay. So you can pay, if you want to buy a Harvard, 6'2", blonde-haired, blue-eyed woman's egg when she's A+ average and she's the head of the hockey team, it's $100,000, and that's what we now have. This is America. You want it, you can afford it, you can buy it.
So also we want to talk a little about people know about IVF and how much does it cost? Who insures it? And the United States has very different rules than other countries about this.
Yes, so great question. So in vitro fertilization is, so about 10% of all men and 10% of all women are infertile, that they can't have a child biologically. So about at least 10% of U.S. couples can't have children but want children. And about almost 20% of American couples have used some kind of infertility services. And the reason for that is there are women who at age 32 could have children, but they delayed having children in order to pursue their careers and are now 38, and it gets much more difficult to have children. So they were fertile younger. Now, because of age, they're infertile. You also have single men by choice, single women by choice, women who say, I'm 35, I haven't met the guy who I want to settle down with, but I want a child, so I'll do IVF. You have single men who say, I haven't found the woman of my dreams, but I want to have a child. You have gay couples, for instance, lesbians, so you have lots of people doing this. So in IVF, they take sperm, they take an egg that's extracted from a woman, they make an embryo, they actually make several embryos, and they then will choose which of the embryos we want. People say, I only want the boy embryos, or I want a genetic testing, I want the embryos that don't have breast cancer, or don't have this or that, and those are the ones I'll use. We'll freeze the rest. So one cycle of IVF costs around $25,000. Most cycles don't work. About 40% of cycles work. It depends on the age of the woman. So if you're 32, it's more likely to be successful. If you're 38, the percent goes down. So usually people need to go through 2 or 3 cycles. You're talking $50,000 to $75,000. What happens though, so up to recently insurance did not cover it. And because there's a demand, obviously, and a lot of women who put off child rearing to have careers want to have children, and companies realize that this is a benefit that's worth offering if they want to keep female employees often. And so companies like Google and Amazon start to pay for it, places like Columbia University. So there's been a push. A few states now say that some IVF coverage must be there in insurance. The amounts vary. So some will say it'll be $5,000 or $10,000 or one cycle of IVF. Interestingly, one country that pays, increasingly though, there are a few countries that pay for as much IVF as you want. So Israel, for instance, will pay basically for as much IVF as you want because they want
be fruitful and multiply.
Be fruitful and multiply, yes. Similarly, places like Italy and Japan, where the population's shrinking, where the number of, there are many more old people than younger people, they want more children. So they're paying for a lot of IVF. So it's the demographics are shifting this. But in the US, most insurance does not cover it.
One thing I thought of, since you're a psychiatrist, I know a few people who've gone through IVF, and it's almost like a full-time job. And it's tremendous stress on their marriage,
huge stress. Tremendous stress on,
do people come to you and talk to you about these things?
Yeah, so that was one of the things, a few things struck me in the book. So as I mentioned, so how I started to get interested in this. And so I interviewed a lot of doctors and patients and mental health professionals who are involved in IVF and nurses. So my eyes were opened up in many ways. So one was, what I didn't know, and this may be my naivete, is the pain of people who want to have a child and can't have a child. Where women will say, everyone I know has children, I don't, I feel like I'm not part of the parent club. All my young female friends are talking about having kids or having babies, and I feel left out. I want to, I can't. And then there's the stress once a couple starts, just given that it's expensive, there is a debate about how much should a child cost. So couples will say, often the woman will say, I really want a child. And of course, having a child is a source of great meaning in people's lives, right? We wouldn't exist here if having more humans wasn't something that we were sort of programmed emotionally to want to do. And so for a lot of people, having a child is immensely important as a source of meaning in their lives, and I get that. And I have connections to nephews and nieces, and that's important. So often the question is how much to spend. So often the woman in a relationship will say, let's empty, at times some women have said, let's empty out our whole savings account, let's mortgage our house, let's sell everything we have to have a child. The man will say, you want me to sell my motorcycle? No way. Literally. So there are often tensions that happen, and how far do you keep going when it doesn't work? And so it is a source of strain. And the other problem, of course, there's a few problems. One is that half of infertility is from the man, half is from the woman. Well, there's what I call the Henry VIII phenomenon, which is men who can't have children will blame their wife rather than realize maybe it's their problem. And so men often don't want to admit that they have problems with, quote, impotence. I mean, who wants to be impotent? Impotent means you don't have power, right? I mean, impotent is what we hope Trump might be someday. So people, a lot of guys who would mean that I'm not macho if something's wrong with me not being able to have a kid. And so women often get blamed, and often the source of the problem won't be addressed.
There's also other reasons, like sperm production, like these kind of things.
Yes, well, right, exactly. So in other words, men may half the time the reason a couple can't get pregnant is because the man has low sperm count or no sperm count.
Varicoceles.
Right, it could be for all kinds of biological reasons that this happens, but men will be very late in getting medical attention for that. Many men.
So there are other ways to have babies besides IVF. People can adopt. People can have surrogates. You address some of these issues. Adoption is hard, is difficult, and they put a lot of obstacles to it. People go to China, and I've had friends who lived in China for 6 months. I've read about this also. And surrogates, is there, I mean, do you think people should try these things before IVF, or it's just personal choice?
Well, so it's a question of how much should everyone just do whatever they want? In other words, a larger question is, should there be regulation? Should there be some kind of oversight, which gets into, and by who and of who? So adoption, many of us know people who 20 years ago would go to Guatemala and adopt a child, go to China. That's become, a lot of countries have said that's un-PC. That's really not cool. We don't want to be in the business of, selling babies from Guatemala, or, having Guatemalan kids or Chinese kids taken by Westerners. In China, for instance, basically been closed down. The Chinese government feels it doesn't look good. What's wrong with us that we're not taking care of our own Chinese babies? Why are we exporting babies? The same with Guatemala. So it's become much harder to adopt a child, that is to adopt a baby. If you want to adopt a foster child, that's easier, but the foster children, the literature shows, often have more mental health problems. If you're adopting a 13-year-old who has been rejected by his or her family, there's a lot of unfortunate psychosocial problems that often come up, etc. So it's gotten more difficult. So a lot of people, so some people I interviewed for the book tried that first and said they found it hard. Others say, I want my own biological child. I don't want someone else's child. I'm willing to pay $25,000 or whatever to undergo IVF to try to have my own child. The other choices in the road are, and difficult choice is a woman who's in her late 30s, early 40s, where a woman is born with all the eggs she will ever have. They age, though, so by the time one's in one's late 30s, the risk of chromosomal abnormalities, particularly Down syndrome, goes way up. And so, and it also becomes more difficult for a woman to get pregnant. Women can get pregnant using someone else's eggs, which is why there's this big business. In fact, the world's oldest first-time mother gave birth 2 months ago. She was 75 years old. So there's a woman in India, gave birth for the first time. She was 75. Her husband, who was 82, had a stroke the next day, was hospitalized, and has not left the hospital. But there's a question, even in this country, of how old is too old. And a problem is that the IVF industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. People will pay a lot of money to have a child. They want a child, and there are people who pay $100,000 to have a child. 10% of America wants to have a child and can't. And so do the math, it's a lot of money. And so you have venture capital companies that are now buying up IVF clinics. And as I point out in the book, there are a lot of procedures. So IVF has helped a lot of people have kids, right? We all know, probably whether we know it or not, someone who has had children through IVF, and it's been a source of great joy in their life. That being said, a concern I have is that the industry is doing a number of things that are putting profit motive over the best interests of their patients. And so there's a lot of...
That's shocking in medicine.
Unfortunately, it's right. So unfortunately, they're not alone in doing that.
Yeah.
I think IVF is a little different because it tends to be people paying out of pocket. Insurance companies don't have a role in overseeing what happens. So the insurance companies, I think, play too much of a role in many areas of medicine, where they're saying, what do you mean, your doctor wants a whatever procedure, we need to okay it first. In this case, no one's overseeing it. And so, for instance, there's a procedure called ICSI, which is Intracytoplasmic Sperm Injection, which is was originally intended for men with low sperm counts. You take the egg, You take a sperm, you put it in a syringe, and you basically squirt it right into the middle of the egg to make sure that it gets fertilized. So this was meant for the 10% for people who have male infertility. It was soon used on now used on two-thirds of everyone who undergoes IVF. Turns out it doubles the rate of intellectual disabilities in the child and of severe intellectual disabilities. But in this country, no one's collecting the data and no one really cares. So the data is coming out from places like Australia, because in Australia, where there's a national health system, they were able to see who in first or second or third grade has intellectual disabilities, and they're able to look in the data and say, oh my God, there is a disproportionate number of people who had IVF and had ICSI done, because we paid for it as a government. So we were able to see these people who had all this ICSI done, now the kids are coming into third grade with problems. In this country, no one's collecting the data. A problem, as I point out in the book, is the CDC. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have to repeat what I said. I don't remember.
We're going to start over now?
No, it's just that it's
Okay.
The other microphone is not working at all.
Mine isn't?
Yeah, hold it right up.
Right up? Okay. All right.
Okay, is that better if we hold it?
I think it's better if you hold it up.
Okay. So I wrote the book because, no. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Oh, so the CDC collects data, but it's voluntary whether clinics give their data. So if clinics don't want to give their data, they don't have to give it. So the CDC collects less data than European governments collect on IVF done there. So there's limited data collected, quite a bit of data, but still limited, relatively speaking, and clinics don't have to give it. And clinics that haven't been giving their data have been getting more business because they can say whatever they want. You know, they say we guarantee a child, and there's no data showing they don't. Whereas clinics that give their data, patients can go online and see, wait, your success rate's only 30%.
So basically you have to be rich to have IVF.
Unfortunately, by and large, you have to be rich. This creates problems, for instance, as I mentioned, people can now screen embryos. Well, if you're wealthy and you have breast cancer in your family, you can now screen embryos and only choose embryos that don't have breast cancer genes in them. If you're poor, you can't do that. So diseases like breast cancer, which now unfortunately affect both wealthy and poor people, in the future will become diseases of poor people, because wealthy people will be able to get rid of the genes. So I think these raise...
But so many people get breast cancer who have no genetic predisposition, so there'll still be breast cancer.
There'll still be breast cancer, but disproportionately,
right.
It will be increasing, whereas now it unfortunately affects everyone. Increasing, you're right, so about half of breast cancer is, less than half, but about 20% of breast cancer is the genetic kind. There are probably other genes we don't know yet. So it'll be disproportionately a disease of poor more than being equal.
Christine, do you have a question?
Yes. I didn't read the book yet, but I'm looking forward to it. Did you address the male sperm about Apert syndrome? When the men get old, the sperm become defective, and there's a higher risk of Apert syndrome, which is about 7 different disorders in one. Did you talk about it in here?
Yes. So the problem is so it turns out so one issue is that there's a lot we don't know in this area. And I should say part is because in sex and reproduction have taboos around them. So there's a lot of things that people haven't researched, we know about, etc. So it turns out that when men get older, their sperm ages, or production of sperm ages. And so there's an increased risk, particularly of autism and schizophrenia, and other diseases as well. So similar to how there's problems with Down syndrome as women get older, with men there are problems as well.
Right, and the syndrome is Apert syndrome. So people always think about the young egg, but if any of you ladies are freezing your eggs, you have to think about young sperm. It's just as important. You know, we are all born with our cells.
Yes.
Our cells are our cells, and they all age. So whether you're making new sperm or new eggs, we are from two cells, and they age.
Yes. So actually, the eggs, a woman's eggs are all with her at birth. The other cells in our bodies turn over around every 7 days. So literally every 7 days you have a new body. That most cells they die and new cells are made.
Right, that's apoptosis, but so some cells do regenerate, like the liver, for example. Other cells are terminal. So yes, some cells can regenerate and some cells can't.
Yes, so, right, so there's many cells regenerate. Egg cells certainly stand out because they're there from birth. Other cells, for instance, nerve cells, continue to grow in ways that from when we're, come out of the womb till as we get older. So there are a number of diseases. So freezing eggs raises a number of interesting issues. So as many of you may know, there has become a large market of freezing eggs. So there are sperm banks, there are egg banks, etc. So a lot of women and companies like Google and Facebook have encouraged their female employees in their late 20s to freeze their eggs. So they'll say, we'll pay for it, freeze your eggs. This way you don't have to worry about quitting Google or Facebook and having to, because you want to have kids, you can delay it. The problem is a lot of women then think that's a guarantee. Unfortunately, it's not. So there have been a few instances where the freezers break down. And so thousands of eggs are lost. In some cases, hundreds of thousands of eggs are lost because freezers break down. Secondly, there's no data on how good the eggs are after freezing for 5 years. So we've looked for, after 5 years, the eggs are good, but we don't know what happens after 10 or 15 years. The other problem, a few other problems. One is that often women don't freeze enough eggs. So they'll say, well, I'll freeze 30 eggs, that should be enough. Well, you defraw them. 10 years from now, they might not all be good. And what's happening is a lot of women are finding to make embryos and to make embryos that implant and then form a pregnancy and have a live birth and a healthy live birth, the numbers go down. Part of that's because even though a woman can get pregnant when she's 40, the success rate's only about 20%. The success rate goes down. It's possible, but it's a little harder. The last thing is that it turns out, interestingly, that something like 85% of people who freeze their eggs never use them. Because they end up, deciding to having sex with their husband or whomever, or boyfriend, and having a child, and they don't. So the eggs that they freeze, they don't know, but they've been paying thousands of dollars all along. So a concern I have is that again, the industry is often marketing to young women based on fear. Freeze your egg. This is a way to guarantee you can keep working. You don't have to worry about it, and it's a little more complicated than that.
So I just want to take because I don't know if the feedback up front in terms of the buzzing sound, but back here it's quite pronounced. So the question is the buzzing sound bothering people?
It's not buzzing anymore.
No.
It's not buzzing.
It's not buzzing anymore.
Okay. Well, okay. So
You moved it, so.
Keep going, because I was going to say, you both have.
We moved the box.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It can work.
Okay.
So in this corner it's very buzzy. But up front, maybe it's not.
It's
It's
buzzing
better.
when we talk, or
Yeah.
But it's better now when they move the box. Oh.
do I need a mic?
No,
No.
that's what I'm sort of
Okay, all right,
suggesting.
okay, so maybe we don't need the mic.
You know, from us
Are you recording this?
fellows, so I
Yes.
think maybe we should just go without a mic.
Okay, all right, so we'll go without a mic. Yes, the question. You're going to call the questions? You want me to call? You call the questions.
Go ahead.
So I'm wondering, when people are going to do IVF, do they do a full genetic test on their own chromosomes to see, in case they're afraid of passing something on? And if they do, are people finding out what they have? And how are they reacting to finding out in their 30s that, they're going to get Huntington's or something? Then maybe their sisters and or brother finds out. I mean, how's that all?
So those are great questions. So, did people hear the question? Okay. So there is several different kinds of genetic testing. One is there used to be targeted testing for specific diseases. So let's say my mother had breast cancer, let's say, and I want to check to make sure I don't have breast cancer. Then there is certain, depending on your background and family history, before you have children, there may be certain kinds of testing. So if you're an Ashkenazi Jew or you're African American, they may check for, Tay-Sachs or sickle cell or various things. So what's happened is that, so certain amount of testing beforehand, now there's testing being done, I should say, so that there's sort of testing for what's called SNPs, for different particular genes. Now we can do whole genome sequencing. We can test your whole genome. And there the problem is we're finding lots of stuff that we don't understand. So the first time someone's whole genome was sequenced was 17 years ago. It cost $1 billion with a B. Over the past 17 years, the price has gone from 1 billion to 100 million to 10 million to 1 million. So it's now about $1,000. So as the price goes down, lots of people are having genetic testing done, right? And you see 23andMe still is looking at partial tests. Well, as of a few years ago, most DNA scientists decided it was junk DNA. They didn't know what it did, so it was thought to be junk. Well, it's not junk. It's just we don't know what it is, right? So increasingly what's happening is that companies are saying, we'll test your whole DNA. And so people are finding stuff, for instance, we're finding out that you have triple the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Your risk goes from 5% to 15%. So there's still an 85% chance you're not going to get Alzheimer's disease, but your rate is triple that of the population. So, and people don't understand this, and the data is quite limited on this. We don't fully know what all these numbers and genetic markers mean. So, in answer to your question, increasingly people are getting testing done more widely. Another issue more specifically here is there's now what's called non-invasive prenatal testing, which is when a woman's pregnant, it used to be to find out the genes of the fetus, you'd have to do amniocentesis and stick a needle in, and often you lost the pregnancy. Now you can just take blood from the woman's arm, and you can basically figure out the genes of the fetus because there's enough fetal DNA floating around. And this is where companies are now saying, for $1,000, we'll tell you everything. And so people are finding out, gee, your fetus has a risk of Alzheimer's disease or risk of all these other things, much of which is not actionable. And so there's, again, companies are making a lot of money off this. I was asked by the FDA recently to comment. A company started to market a gene to predict suicidality. And they asked me what I think. So I looked at the literature, and there's been just one study published on 30 patients paid for by the company selling the test. And so there's a lot of junk science out there, frankly, that people are marketing tests. There's another test which was for doctors to decide whether or not, if they put someone on a painkiller, an opiate as a painkiller, whether or not the person would become addicted. So this is going to predict your addictiveness. Again, nonsense science. You can't really predict something. It depends how long they're on it, what else is going in their lives, their stress, this or that. But you have companies who are selling this stuff. And there's a larger debate. Should the FDA be monitoring this stuff? I think they should. That's a minority opinion. A lot of people think, the FDA shouldn't get involved in this. And of course, there's billions of dollars at stake here.
Well, reading the book, I see that a lot of couples that want to guarantee it. We're going to have a smart child who has no defects, and even with the best testing, you can't guarantee that. And even if they have a risk of Alzheimer's, there's no drug to treat Alzheimer's.
Right, correct.
Yeah.
So this is the problem, and this gets into the issue of gene editing and CRISPR, which is what's coming down the pike, where we have more information than we know what to do with it. That's not a good sense, but you know what I'm saying. And part of this is because the science and the technology has gone like this, right? It was all in all our aspects of our lives. There's huge technology, and we haven't yet figured out the ethical, the social, the legal implications, should this be monitored, et cetera. And so the same thing goes for sort of Facebook having all this data on us, or now Google is getting into the business of buying up medical records. And so they can then target you and say, here's the latest, I see from your records you have diabetes, here's the latest diabetes drug that we're going to make a profit on, or whatever it is. And so there's a lot of areas of our lives where technology is presenting all these questions that need to be figured out. And the book sort of looks at a number of these.
Go ahead.
How can Google buy medical records? Is that legal?
So I think it was University of Chicago healthcare system. It was announced in the Times in the business section, I think 2 days ago. And so I think it was University of Chicago Health System said that it was going to sell all of its electronic healthcare records to Google.
But there's a HIPAA laws, there are laws that you can't.
No,
you
it's
have to
actually,
do
it's actually, if you read the article, it turns out it's actually legal, what they did. It's not ethical, but it's legal.
Right. So, again, I don't know, what's interesting is most of the interesting bioethical issues now are not in the health section, they're in the business section. Right? So, I don't remember, Susan, do you know the detail? I sort of just saw the headline and,
Yeah, so the thing is, so the reality is that Google, if you think about it as an entity, I mean, I think this is the argument that Google, but the reality is it's actually, Google is not a person. Google is actually a lot of individual Google employees, real human beings who are seeing names attached to data. And there's arguments on both sides that this aggregate information will yield all kinds of better health care, but the flip side is, to some degree, some people's privacy has been invaded if the Google employee somehow
Right.
leaks the information. But Google as a corporation, I think it's actually legal that you sign this, in fact, in your HIPAA agreement, that third parties can use this for
Yeah,
research purposes and blah, blah, blah.
right,
The founder,
That's what I
the founder of
remember what I-
23andMe was married to a Google
yeah.
person.
Sergey Brin, who ran the 3-person. Yeah.
Right, and when they got divorced, all of a sudden she was investigated by the FDA.
Right.
But
Just
I have a question
Yes.
about sperm banks, because
Yes.
famously there are these particular sperm donors who are
OBs.
Harvard, Harvard undergraduate, Yale Law School, blah, 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 and then they have,
Yeah.
however many,
Right.
they're the most desirable. But what do the sperm banks do to validate, A, the credentials, and B, the medical history?
Right. So the answer is nothing. They're not, well, look, put it this way, they're not required to do anything. So sperm banks are completely unregulated. Egg donor agencies are completely unregulated. Anyone here can open up a sperm bank or an egg donor agency tomorrow and just recruit people and be the middleman buying and selling this stuff. So, and this has been a big problem. So on the one hand, there have been people who have fathered, in this country, 150 kids, for instance. In Europe, in England, there's a guy who's fathered 800 children, and he wants to get up to 1,000. I can only imagine what his ego's like. So there's a problem, and of course, it turns out then there have been a few cases. There was a case that was actually reported in the Times a few weeks ago of a man who sold his sperm and was told that only something like 6 children would be created, and instead, 25 plus kids were created. There have been a few cases where an IVF doctor has in fact used his own sperm to create hundreds of kids. In fact, there's a show, Slate asked me to review a new show that's on Fox TV, the only time I've watched Fox TV, called Almost Family, in which the premise of the show is that there is an IVF doctor who has fathered hundreds of children, and each time would tell the woman, oh no, we're using this sperm donor, Harvard, whatever it is. In fact, it was him. The show, the opening scene is 2 young people meet in a bar, 2 millennials. They go and have sex, and they then find out they're half siblings. And the show goes on from there. But it actually raises interesting questions of, which actually will get back to being the sperm donor issue, as I mentioned earlier. So in the show, people who hated each other find out that they're half siblings and they move in together. Or they wonder, what is the relationship now that we find we're half siblings? And what's driven a lot of the revelations about this is 23andMe. So now people can get genetic testing done, online. You just send in a swab, and 23andMe will tell you everyone who's a close relative of yours. And so people are finding out, my God, I have 25 half siblings I never knew about. Or 150 half-siblings I never knew about, and that's why there's suddenly this sort of greater interest in this. What's interesting is what I found for the book is that, as I mentioned earlier, most people who buy someone else's sperm or eggs never tell anyone about it. They don't want the kid to know because they're afraid the kid will think, won't love them as much. If the kid finds out, gee, I'm not really the biological father, or that's not really my genetic mother, the kid will love me less. It turns out the research shows the opposite, that the research suggests that parents tell children from a young age, a nice man or a nice woman helped us bring you into the world, et cetera, et cetera. Otherwise, children feel betrayed when they find out. Often they find out either through 23andMe or because, Aunt Sally blurts out in a fight, that's not even your father, So these issues come up, and I think people, and unfortunately, getting back to the IVF industry, the IVF industry, the ASRM, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, has an ethics committee that comes up with documents. So they say, they very lightly recommend that doctors tell patients to tell the children. I think it's wrong. I think they should say doctors should tell the children. And so a lot of docs say, well, I tell, and I put this in the book, I tell patients they don't want to tell their kids that's okay. In other words, they don't want to sort of confront patients and tell patients things patients don't want to hear. And so, unfortunately, a lot of people don't know. I think people have a right to know who their genetic parents are, and the information is important. Interestingly, also, with egg donation, sperm donation, in most of Western Europe, in the US, it's almost all anonymous. So if I donate sperm to a sperm bank or a woman sells her eggs, no one keeps a record of the person's name who donates, who the children are, who were created, etc. No records are kept up until a few months ago. In Europe, it's the opposite. In Europe, most countries in Europe, there is no donation is anonymous. It's all somewhere there's a record that's kept that this is, John Doe who donated sperm, and these 4 children were created, and then in the future, so in the future when the child turns 18, the child could potentially find out, just like with adoption, if both parties are willing to meet, that can happen. Finally, ASRM just a few months ago said that clinics should keep records, but it could still be anonymous, and so it could be set up that no one will ever find out your identity.
Cheryl?
So I have two questions. One is there, and I haven't read the book yet, I can't wait to read it. Is there a message? Is this just a, buyer beware, or what's the purpose? And the second thing is there anybody doing, mental health study of the couples and the marriages and all the rest? I think I told you, I had 10 IVFs, I didn't get pregnant, we did get pregnant anyway, and I had 2 sons. When I tried to pitch stories about, I was still upset having gone through that, everybody would say to me, but you have 2 kids. So, and I mean, I don't have any mental health issues, but there's a lot of trauma around that.
Of course.
So is anybody really, and you kind of touched on it, is anybody investigating this? Are there psychologists at all of these places now? Are people sort of looking into their mental health history?
So there's not enough research. So there are mental health professionals. We have some here actually who are involved. So most clinics have a mental health professional who they have see patients when there are issues that come up, and particularly donors are screened, for instance, to make sure that they'll be okay being a donor, et cetera. But there's very, very little data that's collected, and when it is, it's just one clinic's experience. So the amount of information remains relatively limited. There's surprisingly very little research that's been done. Part of this is because, the industry isn't really interested. They're interested in making money. They're not really interested in finding out their mental health problems here, is one. Secondly, a lot of mental health research is conducted by NIH. So NIH has felt that this is not a high priority area. We, sitting on Fifth Avenue, most of whom are middle class or middle class plus, know people going through this. But if you're NIH and you're dealing with the opioid epidemic at the moment, or you're dealing with suicides going up, those are seen as priorities, understandably. I think it's unfortunate there's not some funding, which would be a lot for this as well. And as you say, I think there's a huge silent epidemic. I was, shouldn't say surprised, but I was impressed by the number of people who said, having a miscarriage is having a death in the family, where it's a huge loss, and I get that. In terms of the message for the book, so my sense was, one, people don't know about this stuff, right? Like, this is an area that, even though this is affecting a huge percent of the American population, I should say, 10% of people 10% of everyone's infertile. And in Denmark at the moment, 7% of all births in Denmark, for instance, are born through IVF. The number here is up to 4% in some states. It's going to go up. Soon it'll be 10%, right? 10% of people will be born using infertility services. So, but there are taboos around talking about it. As I said, men don't want it known, gee, I'm having trouble, I have a low sperm count. That's not something guys like to talk about. Women are more open, but even there, women often don't want to talk about it, or the man doesn't want to talk about it, etc. So I think that there should be more awareness of these issues, is one. Secondly, that I think we need to change policy. I think, for instance, the CDC not collecting data on this or making data submission voluntary on the part of clinics should be changed. I think there's a lot of practices of what the IVF industry is doing that should be changed. So there's specific things like that. And I think more attention, that people should be aware that everyone knows someone who has been going through this, and it's often a source of pain. And couples going through this feel greatly isolated often. So I think the more awareness of this, the better.
I want to pick someone else. This question over there.
You spoke about how a lot of the information we get from genetic testing isn't necessarily actionable, like you're having an increased risk of Alzheimer's, etc. I know there are some conditions where the genes really are informative, like breast cancer, but in addition to not being actionable, that information is based off of genome-wide association studies, right? And I don't really get why they're so significant that, they're all published in Nature, but to me, this is just correlations.
Right.
Well, there are some, Huntington's disease and things like that. I mean, there are some things that are well known that you want to screen for: Tay-Sachs disease,
Cystic fibrosis.
yes, cystic fibrosis. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But something like Alzheimer's, it's not really as clear, or depression, a lot of anxiety. I know they're being used a lot they're a lot right now in psychiatry for different mental health conditions, and it's so unclear, I think, that...
Right, so why is it being published? Well, one, so we understand very little about the human genome, right? So when the genome was first sequenced 17 years ago, which is nothing in the history of mankind, right? I mean, and DNA, the way DNA encodes information was just discovered by Watson and Crick about 60 years ago. And even 10 years ago, scientists thought we would find the cancer gene, the depression gene, the alcohol gene. And instead we're finding that genes are incredibly complicated, that for things like intelligence, there are probably hundreds. We know that IQ is 50% genetic and 50% environmental, but the genetic is probably hundreds of genes. And so the analogy I use is like saying there's a traffic jam. Okay, there's a traffic jam, that's a problem. What's the cause of the traffic jam? Well, it could be a car broke down. It could be Trump is in town. It could be because a car broke down because they're out of gas. It could be an accident. It could be an accident with 2 cars or 3 cars. So there could be many, many reasons for diseases. So what genetics are doing is we're finding out what the cause is, but it turns out to be much more complicated than we thought. The analogy in a way is, if someone asked Christopher Columbus in 1500, what did he find? He would say, I found some islands off the coast of India. 300 years later, Lewis and Clark are still trekking around, discovering new languages and new cultures and rivers that no one knew existed and things like that. So it took several hundred years to map America. And so similarly, to really map genes, it's going to take, I think, decades. An issue, though, is that companies smell money. And so there's a huge amount of biotech interest, and if you, on gene therapy, for instance, so we've now gene therapies that cost $2 million a person, per patient. And increasingly, there will be drugs found for different conditions that will cost, that will be patentable. In other words, if someone can figure out what to do with a gene that could cure a disease or cause a disease, potentially it's a patentable thing that's going to bring in huge amounts of money, billions and billions of dollars. And so there's a great push, and there's a lot of hype. We are finding things, just it's not relevant. It's like saying in this room, I'm going to tell you the molecular composition of the paint. Well, that's interesting. No one knew that before, so you can get it published, right? No one knew what the molecular composition of the paint was, but that doesn't tell us much about the way the room looks.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Me?
Nothing, you do.
Me.
Friend, yeah, because
Yeah.
you're friends.
Yeah. So, when I first saw the title of the book, Designing Babies, I mean, I thought, what an incredibly profound title when you really think about it, because in the history of the world, babies have never been designed. You know, boy meets girl and something happens. So, when I read that title, I thought, this invokes the power of the gods. So, as technology continues to rapidly advance, how should we be thinking about the ethical challenges? Because I'm not sure we have a framework. I certainly don't, for completely understanding, having the power of the gods.
Right. Yes, so, great point. So I think that to a certain degree we need to figure out how to respond ethically. I think in terms of framework, so in bioethics, and as mentioned, I run a bioethics program, just FYI, we have lots of free videos and stuff online and courses and degrees, just end of commercial. But so there are certain principles. So we're concerned about people's rights, right? So on the one hand, in this area, the feeling has been in the US that you have the right, if you want to choose a boy, you can choose a boy. Just that principle is the way that gets interpreted, even though that's not the case in in Western Europe, where in a lot of countries you can't just say, I just want a boy, give me a boy. But, so that's a choice, okay? So to what degree does a parent have the right to say that is one issue. The other sets of ethical principles involve basically risks and benefits. So what are the risks involved? What are the benefits? And how do we weigh those? So the reason designing babies has become more important in the past year also is because we now have a technology called CRISPR, where we can actually change the genes in the cell. So we can go in and when there's this, egg meets sperm, it creates a one-cell embryo. Then the embryo then becomes 2 cells, and 4, then 8, then 16, and eventually becomes one of us. When it's one cell, we can go and we can now take out certain genes or put in certain genes.
It's called editing.
It's editing, right. So we can put in a gene that'll give you a little bit increase in IQ. We can put in the near future, we'll be able to put in genes related to blonde hair, blue eyes, or perfect pitch or height. We can give you some genes that'll give you height. So this was thought to be kind of experimental, and then 3 years ago, a scientist in China announced that he had done this with the human embryo. Scientists got concerned. They said, okay, that's fine, but just don't implant the embryo into a woman to create a child. Then, about a year ago, a Chinese scientist, Dr. He Jiankui, announced that he, in fact, had implanted the embryo into a woman and created children. And so this is even more the case of playing God. So the question are, so how do we think about it? What are the risks, what are the benefits? Well, the risks here are, first of all, we don't know enough about genetics. So if you start fiddling around with genes, it turns out that he thought he was gene editing is taking a scissors, sort of, and taking out certain genes. He thought he was taking out this. Turns out he took out this, right? So it's still new, it's imprecise. Secondly, there's a risk. So there's risks, in other words, that there may be other kinds of damage we may cause. What are the benefits? So if it was just to get rid of a disease, let's say you knew you were going to have a child with a terrible disease was going to die, but we can do gene editing and we can make the kid healthy. There's benefit there that you can't otherwise have that may offset the risks. In this case, the reason he did this in this case was the father had HIV, and he wanted to make sure that the HIV didn't get to the child. So he took out a gene that helps HIV get into cells. The problem is if you take out that gene, there's an increased risk of other viruses like influenza getting into cells, and we have ways of preventing an HIV-positive father. We can do sperm washing, so you can remove the HIV from the sperm. So and there's treatments for HIV. So this guy, Dr. He Jiankui was taking all this risk without any real benefit that could have been had somewhere else. So again, we think risk, benefit, and then we think justice. Who has access to this? It's social justice, as you know. So in other words, is this going to help everyone? Is it just going to help rich people? It turns out he wanted to form a clinic to design babies and for rich people all over the world. So I think the framework's there. I think part of this, though, is, for instance, in this country, deciding who should decide. So do we want Congress to get involved? And I think Congress at the moment probably couldn't do much, and if they did, it wouldn't be the way a lot of us would want it to be done. And so there are these larger questions in this area. There's a larger question, for instance, how much insurance, some states are now saying that insurance companies should cover some IVF. The question is how much? This is a question I don't have the answer for. So people who are infertile tell me, infertility is a disease, and, it should be covered by my insurance. So should Medicaid cover this? Right? Should all insurance cover it? Given that if the amount of money we have for healthcare is only this big, and you have people with cancer or people with other things, how big a problem is infertility? A lot of people would say, well, infertility is not a disease, right? You're perfectly healthy. You can't have kids. That's unfortunate. But compared to people who have heart disease, diabetes, cancer, Ebola, this is not a priority. So again, the question is how much of a priority should it be? And that's sort of a social decision.
But if insurers get more involved, won't they, will there be more regulation?
There'll be more regulation, yes, right, yes,
Susan?
yes. But I'm just suggesting some of the complexities,
So
yes.
I have a corollary question. If you think about we have a very strong evangelical
Yes,
population who even consider birth control
right,
as,
yeah. Right.
I never pronounced the word right,
Abortifacient.
Okay.
They're against
That
it,
birth control is a form of abortion.
right.
What kind of pushback is there, and how much influence does the evangelical?
Right. So it's quite interesting. In this area, when we first begin, so the process of testing embryos genetically before you implant them in the womb is called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or genetic testing. So when this was started, the doctors who were doing it were able to get rid of diseases that would otherwise be passed on. They were afraid that the religious right would stop the whole thing. Turns out, the notion that if you could pay more, you can get a better child, appeals to the right. In other words, the notion that if you have the money to buy a better child, that's fine, right? So they actually thought, this is great,
I mean,
right?
Forgetting about their personal desire for a better
Right.
child or whatever, I mean, does this, for the most pure evangelicals,
Yeah.
is there something in the Bible that doesn't prohibit it? I mean, does this somehow work with the Bible? It's so,
Yes, right.
it's so futuristic that the Bible somehow never
Yeah.
addressed this, and therefore it's
Right.
okay?
So it's complicated. So on the one hand, I interviewed for the book a number of evangelicals and Orthodox Jews, for instance, and they said, we love PGD, because let's say there's various diseases in the Orthodox community, because there's a lot of inbreeding, to put it bluntly. And so in the past, it would be a child, parents would have to abort the child if they found out the fetus has a disease. Now, they can screen the embryo before it's implanted, so PGD lets you avoid abortion. So the Orthodox community loves PGD because it means you can avoid abortion. You can test the embryo beforehand. So I think that's one. The other side is what patients and doctors tell me is that a lot of people who are members of evangelical communities will say, I know I'm evangelical, I'm not supposed to do this, so please don't tell my priest, but I want to get pregnant, So, and then, as I describe in the book, a lot of doctors tell me, we know which Orthodox rabbis say okay and which don't. So if an Orthodox couple comes to us and says, we really want to do this, but I'm afraid what my rabbi will say, the doctor will say, well, I happen to know Rabbi blah, 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 will be okay with it. So there's a
rabbi who let Jared Kushner fly on Saturday.
What's that?
There's the rabbi who let Jared Kushner
Yeah,
fly
right,
on
yes,
Saturday.
right. So it's a great question, and it's complicated. What's interesting is a lot of patients I interview, and I've talked about this in the book, will say that they were undergoing IVF or any of these procedures, and they have evangelical friends or family in some cases who say, this is terrible. How could you be doing this? You're playing God. And they'll say, I want a kid, or they'll say, I've learned don't talk to my family about this because they're not going to approve of it.
Well, I guess I'm writing some book chapters for a book on birth control, and I did talk about the Jewish view of birth control, and they want babies. So they're for any of this stuff. They're not really opposed to the if the science can help produce more babies who will be Jewish and, fill up the Orthodox homes, they're not going to oppose it. I mean, when I worked at Pfizer, they went to the Pope before Viagra got approved, and he blessed Viagra because it would allow more Catholic women to have babies. So,
That's good marketing to the Pope.
Here, and then we'll have one more question, and I'm going to stop.
Does the book deal with surrogate parents?
It does, yes.
A lot.
Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, yes. Yes, it's quite a bit in the book, and it's very relevant for us in New York at the moment.
It's about to happen, right? It's going to get legal.
Well, I'll mention that in a second. So surrogacy is when, like a gay couple, for instance, or a woman who can't use her womb will pay another woman to carry a child. So you can either have a sister do it for free, or you can pay a woman. In California, this is
Their mother.
or their mother, yes. So there are some women who say, I can't carry a child. Mom, will you carry the child for me? And that happens. Or doctors decide, should that happen, but often it happens. In California, this is a big business. It's legal. In New York, it's not legal. And so the state assembly, or the state senate in June, voted to make it legal. And the reason they said do that in New York is because the advocates for this wanted a state where there was blue all the way through, Democratic governor, assembly, and senate, and so New York, that suddenly happened, and so it went through, was approved by the Senate. When it came before the assembly in June, you may remember, Gloria Steinem wrote a letter to Governor Cuomo that was published in the New York Times saying, this is terrible because it will lead to exploitation of poor women of color who will be paid to sell their bodies as surrogates. And it'll lead to human trafficking because the law says that women only have to be residents in New York for 3 months, and so there'll be women from South America or Ukraine who'll be brought here to have kids. So I think that there is the possibility, so it's being reintroduced. Turns out, and I talk about this in the book, there's very little data. There's only one published article on who the women are who are paid gestational surrogates in California. It's been going on for years. There's only one article that shows that, and there are a few studies that show that are from England where it's not paid. The one article here says it's actually mostly white, middle, working class women who say, look, if you're going to pay me $80,000 to be pregnant and I can be home and take care of my kids, that's a lot of money for me, $80,000. I'll take it. And I understand, I've been pregnant before. I know what it's like. ASRM, to its credit, says that women should have been pregnant on their own, have their own kids. So I think that actually Gloria Steinem's statement that's going to exploit poor women of color, the data does not support that. I mean, it is a concern. So what I've told Brad Hoylman, who is the gay state senator from the Upper West Side, who's reintroducing it, is that they should build into the bill that we're going to see who the women are. In other words, if we pass it, we're going to see, what is the ethnicity of women who are, quote, renting their wombs? It turns out there's zero data, right? As I just did the one article. And the CDC, for instance, could easily be collecting that, right? In California, why is there no data collected on who the women are? Are they poor people of color? Turns out they're not, but the evidence suggests it, but it's a little bit of evidence.
Well, it amazes me, we live in a world where so much data is collected by Google and we know very little data. I mean, in Colorado, there was great opposition to legalizing marijuana. And one of them was that we were going to get 1 million women coming to our state who have epileptic kids. And they would be just flooded with people who had epilepsy or all kinds of things. None of this happened. There was no data to support it. But that was an argument. So arguments are made up against things, and there's very little data. And we live in a world where we can have a lot of data, but for some reason, we don't want to do it.
So I think CDC should collect it. Clinics don't want to give the data.
Yeah.
And
It's money.
It's money, but I spoke at the ASRM 3 weeks ago, and I said this. People said, "Oh, but it's a lot of money to collect the data. That takes time." I said, "You're a multi-billion-dollar industry, and you're talking about a few thousand women just to list what the ethnicity. Oh, well, the data may not be correct. People just put the data. The secretary puts the data, and I said, come on, I mean, so it's 80% correct. I mean, you know, the notion that therefore we shouldn't collect it, I think is ridiculous.
All right, well, this will be our last question, so go ahead.
Just to follow up on the surrogacy, have you done any studies on like the legal ramifications of surrogacy law and how that's like affected, you know, is the child more important, is the surrogate more important? I'm just kind of curious, because it always seems to come up, that's a big ethical question, whose life is more valuable.
You mean if there's a need for an abortion, for instance, or what?
So like say during pregnancy sometimes if there's complications, there's whose life is more important? Is it obviously to the parents that created this child, the child is more important, but in reality is it the woman who's actually carrying the baby? You know, there's all these like,
Yeah, so it needs to be carefully done. So I would say in that case, the woman's life is more important, right? I mean, so if it means losing the pregnancy, but versus saving the life of the woman's life should be saved.
but then, you know, there's the financial responsibility of the people, and they're like, okay, I've spent, you know, $75,000, $100,000 on this, and it's like, this is my one shot.
So this is an informed consent issue. So in other words, when parents enter into a surrogacy agreement, and part of the reason it's expensive, there are 3 lawyers. There's a lawyer for, you know, everyone has a lawyer. So, right, so it needs to be very clear that, so there's a few issues. If there's complications, how are we going to deal with it? So a gay couple, for instance, arranging this will understand that if we do this, yes, she's going to, blah, blah, blah. If there are complications, specifically, not just I have a headache, but, you know, there's risks to the woman's health, then we will have an abortion or whatever. So it needs to be all spelled out.
Okay, I want to thank everyone for coming. Robert's selling books over here.
Thank you. Thank you.